Right, welcome to, oops, sorry about that. Welcome to WASA Distance Education. This is NBV3E, Grade 11 Native Studies. That is Beliefs, Values, and Aspirations of Aboriginal Peoples in Contemporary Society. I'm Pete, and I'm your teacher. So this is week 4 of our 9-week semester. So we're really making good progress here. Are we halfway there? We're about halfway through the course, which is great. As a matter of fact, we're going to finish up Unit 2 this week. Now, this is only Class 2. Yesterday we just didn't have class at all, so we're just on Class 2 of this week. So you're not missing anything if you're watching this on the archive, or if you're watching it on YouTube. You'll notice that we're missing a class from yesterday. You didn't miss a class; you just wasn't in class yesterday. All right. Now, if you'll remember what we did on Monday, we were in lesson 9, and we were talking about residential schools. Now, that is a tough subject for some people, and it's overall okay. We'll just keep on going here. Um, but it is important for us to understand what happened. We study the past. Very often, it helps us to understand um, how things got to be the way they are, and it helps us avoid mistakes, I guess, would be one thing. So this is where we started on Monday. I'll just do a little recap here. So we're on lesson 9. There are 10 we go up to lesson 10 in Unit 2, and then we'll be done Unit 2. And I think we're probably going to get to that, certainly by tomorrow. We'll get to lesson 10. So that's pretty good. Okay. So what we learned on Monday was about the whole history of residential schools and how they started, where originally the government's goal was to assimilate Aboriginal people. So they developed these schools, and they had they made agreements with the various religious institutions to run these schools, and the idea was that it would basically turn Aboriginal children into uh, children that were more like the European people living in Canada at the time, right? The people from Europe. So that was the problem, right? And we talked about maybe that maybe there was some good intention there, but it was certainly, looking back, we know it was the wrong thing to do. But worse, there was, it was one thing for the government to be trying to assimilate Aboriginal people by teaching their children basically the ways of other peoples in Canada, sort of changing their worldview, changing their identity to be more like European descendants. But what really can't be forgiven at all, and I mean, there's no excuse for it, is that in some schools and some children were exposed to physical and sexual abuse, and were, psychological abuse. And that's just, there's no real getting around that. That was just flat out wrong. Okay. So that's what and the issue there is that we're left with some a great deal of difficulty. There was many generations of Aboriginal children that went through these schools, and so the ones that were abused have lasting um, trauma as a result of that. Okay, so that's one thing. But even students that didn't experience any abuse at all were still, not really served well by the system. A system that was by design intended to change their identity, to change their worldview. So imagine a young child comes out of a community, goes to one of these schools, and then when they go back to the community, they don't speak the language, they don't really understand the customs and the traditions of their own people. It basically turns them into a stranger, an outsider in their own communities. So this is the lasting legacy of the residential schools. Okay, so what we talked about then was that, and And let's just take a look at this quote on the top of page 20. And this is an excerpt from this, I believe it's the report on uh, residential schools. So it says, sadly, our history with respect to the treatment of Aboriginal people is not something in which we can take pride. Attitudes of racial and cultural superiority led to a suppression of Aboriginal culture and values. So there you go. Right. I mean, you can't make it any more clearer than that. Indeed, that is what happened, right? As a country, we are burdened by past actions that resulted in weakening the identity of Aboriginal peoples, suppressing their language and cultures, and outlawing spiritual practices. We must recognize the impact of these actions on the once self-sustaining nations that were disaggregated, disrupted, limited, or even destroyed by the dispossession of traditional territory, by the relocation of Aboriginal people, and by some provisions of the Indian Act. We must acknowledge that the result of these actions was the erosion of political, economic, and social systems of Aboriginal people and nations. Okay? But then it goes on to say, against the backdrop of these historical legacies, it is a remarkable tribute to the strength and endurance of Aboriginal people that they have maintained their historic diversity and identity. The Government of Canada today formally expresses to all Aboriginal people in Canada our profound regret for past actions of the federal government which have contributed to these difficult pages in the history of our relationship together. Okay, so this is from the official government apology. It's funny, there's some times in your life when you kind of remember where you are. And I remember where I was and what I was doing on the day that the government did that, because we live streamed that to our school. We gathered all of our students into one place, and we actually live streamed that apology so that everyone can hear it all at once. Okay. So the interesting thing is the government said they were sorry, and but then since then, I don't know. I expected a lot of things to change. It doesn't seem to have happened, but maybe my perspective is a little different. My worldview for these things are a little bit different. Okay, so that's part of it. Now we did talk about the schedule, the what did we call it? The daily routine. Okay. And I had mentioned that for me, anyway, the routine similar to that, what I followed in boarding school seemed to be, it was all right for me, right? It gave me structure. But remember, I came from a routine that was not too far away from that. Okay, so for a young child who grown up in a First Nation where, in a remote community where the weather dictated, the sunrise and sunset dictated, the time of year, the season, right? The which animals were available or in season. That's what dictated their schedule, not this minute by minute um, schedule that's imposed on them. So this must have been very difficult, I would think, anyway, for some of the students, maybe all of them coming to these residential schools. Okay. And then I think this is pretty much where we ended off. Would you like living like this? So I've already said, I mean, I don't necessarily like living like this, but that sort of structure, I was already used to that. So that's a very different perspective. Um, and then second, what's missing from the daily activities? And I talked about play and free time, because even in the school I went to, the boarding school, we played a lot, and a lot of it was supervised play, structured play. So it's not like they just said, here's the ball and go out. It was a competition. It was we played a lot of soccer, and we had teams, and so you had to go out and do your best to support your team. And we sometimes played teams from other schools, And so that instilled some values in us as well. You know, being competition, being a gracious winner, being a gracious loser, things like that. I remember our school went and we had different teams. I think it's first, second, third team, something like that. Um, and our our third team just absolutely uh, devastated a team from another school. And it was really there was something not quite right about the mix-up, about the competition. Our third team was supposed to be the smaller students, and this maybe the less talented students, younger, but their team just was even younger and less talented than ours. So our third team really obliterated them. So instead of just letting that stand, the school came and gathered up the rest of us who weren't on a team at the time, and I wasn't, and put together a fourth team, and we had a rematch with their third team. And actually we ended up with a 0-0. I remember it. An Arctic tie is what we called it, which was a lot fairer competition. And it was a lot of fun. We all had a lot of fun trying our best, to play in that game. And it was a very, the team was just kind of put together very quickly. But that's the sort of thing that we had in school. And so people were really concerned about us, but they weren't trying to change our worldview. They weren't trying to change our identity. They were trying to just kind of polish it up and adjust it a little bit. Um, so that would be a very different environment than imagine. So I'm going to play soccer, a game I already liked before I went to play. Imagine if you went to the school, a young Aboriginal boy or girl went to the school and they made them play soccer, which is a game they're not familiar with, and then didn't allow them to play some of their traditional games. Okay, and that's exactly what happened. Okay, so they were made to play games that if they played games, they were made to do things that they didn't like, or that wasn't part of their culture and tradition. Now, there's nothing wrong with introducing a young child to something else. I mean, I played lacrosse, for example, when I was a young boy. Um, but it's not something that somebody really kind of foisted on us and made us do just to the exclusion of everything else. Okay, so that was the environment for um, a lot of students, and now those students are elders and leaders of the community, and so that's something to sort of keep in mind. Okay, so um, so there was a initiative by the government in which they tried to get things back. It's called the Path to Healing. Okay, and well. And so then they also announced an Aboriginal Action Plan, which called for a renewed partnership with Aboriginal people based on recognizing past mistakes and injustices, the advancement of reconciliation, healing, and renewal, and the building of a joint plan for the future. Now, um, one of the complaints recently, this is back in 1998, I know recently there have been some concern, and I can't really speak a lot to this, but there's been some concern that the government has not been um, working in consultation. They've been just imposing. So in other words, they've kind of forgotten what they promised to do, where they were trying to impose a solution for education, for example. Okay. So that's sometimes there's some steps forward and sometimes there's some steps back. It doesn't mean that it's the end, right? There's always tomorrow, and there's always the future. So, um, yeah, um, but it can be a little bit frustrating, dealing with bureaucracy, right? Okay, let's take a look here at just trying to see. Um, Take a look at the course text. and see what they have to say here. Okay, so we okay. Well, yeah, we talked about present day school experiences because now it's different, right? There are elementary schools in most of the communities. Some of the communities have high schools, um, and in some cases there are private high schools, boarding schools for Aboriginal students. But all of those schools are being run by Aboriginal people, so they're being run by the First Nations themselves. So that it means that they can be culturally relevant, and it means that they can be sensitive to their students and to the needs of their students and to the needs of their the families as well. Okay, so we had talked about that. Um, Now let's talk just okay. We're just going to do the support question, sort of in the middle of page 24 of the lesson 9, unit 2, and being asked to read Voices of the People on page 167. So these are all very good little things to read. We won't get, oops, we won't get to all of them. So I hope you take an opportunity to read about them, to read these in your textbook. Okay. So yeah, we don't, because of the time in our online lessons, and we're only 4 days a week. You really, in order to get the most out of this course, you really have to spend some additional time reading the textbook outside of class time. Okay, and that's why I'm putting all the pages up on my Facebook page. So, 167. Oh, at the top of page 167. Oh. There we go. Okay, so this is the quote that we're being asked to look at in support question 3 right here. And this is from Isabel Knockwood, and it's a Mi'kmaq author. And sorry, she's a Mi'kmaq author. And it says here, long before I began writing the book, my mentor counseled me by saying, Isabel, the adult, has to go back into that school and find Isabel the child and take her by the hand and get her out of there. I have done that, and I find myself in a safer place where people are willing to listen, which is the first step of the healing process. Okay. So that's, and it asks us to reflect on Isabel's healing process in a sentence or two. So if you were going to do that, you would basically respond to that. Now, remember that what we're looking for when you're writing a reflection, okay, is not necessarily a agreement with the statement. You could disagree with it. What we're looking at is a response, and disagreement is one response. Agreement's a response. Being neutral is a response. You just, what we're looking for is your opinion. What do you think of it? How does it resonate with you? I use that term resonate, meaning that sometimes you'll read something and go, yeah, gee, that was great, or you'll read something and you go, no, that's terrible, that's awful, I wouldn't. And sometimes you just sort of read something and it doesn't really do anything. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. Okay, and reading an article like this, a short article, is very similar to reading the news. I know I read the CBC News every day. There's an Aboriginal section. If you go to cbc.ca /news, and then right at the top it says Canada, and then it has all the different provinces, and there's a button on there that says Aboriginal, and you click on that and you get all the stories related to Aboriginal people. Okay, and to the north as well, and that's kind of a strange thing because to read about the place where we live, uh, you have to click on the Aboriginal as if there was just Aboriginal people in the north, right? They don't really appreciate, even the CBC doesn't appreciate the complex situations. But anyway, when I read those articles, some articles I read them, and it'll be the article, for example, about Darlene Meekan and her house, and I get outraged about that, right? Because of the injustice that seemed to be happening. And I'll read about a youth going missing, or I'll read about some other issues, and I react to them. Sometimes it's very strongly. Sometimes it's very happy news, right? Something really good. I read about youth who are doing a walk to raise awareness for someone. Um, you know, so that's what we talk about when something resonates with you. And when we're asking you to reflect, we're asking you to write down your thoughts and feelings about it. Sort of in an honest way, right? How do you feel about that? Okay. So sometimes something will make you angry, or sometimes it's upsetting. Now, in this textbook, I think that they're probably not trying to do that. Um, but still, you could respond in a variety of ways. Okay. So you look at this now. For me, I think I understand what the author's trying to say. I think it's a little too short for me to really, to be able to really understand the full meaning, to get a full impact from the author. I think I would need a little bit more of that story for me. So that's something I would probably write down if I was being asked to reflect on it, right? It's a little difficult for me to really know, it, what the author's trying to get at. But I sort of see her as kind of saying, go back and, you can't really change the past, but you can change your attitude about the past. I think that might be what she's trying to say. But again, I'm finding it hard because there's not enough stuff there, not enough writing words to really tell me. Okay. But that's what it says to me. And sometimes writing says other things to other people. Okay? And it's absolutely fine. I recently I was talking to someone online, and I said something to the effect of, "Well, you really Tom Sawyered that, didn't you?" And the person wrote me back and said, "I have no idea what you meant by that." Okay, and so for me, the idea of pulling a Tom Sawyer is that if somebody is in the story Tom Sawyer, Tom was told to paint a fence. Now he hated painting, which is unusual for a young boy, but he hated painting. He really despised it, and the author went on and on and on about how Tom really hated painting. But then his friend came by, and Tom Sawyer pretended to really like painting. And he pretended to like it so much that when his friend, asked him what he was doing, he basically said, "Well, it's too fun. I'm not going to let you do this." And of course, then his friend really wanted to do it. And basically, the long story is that Tom Sawyer, who hated painting, convinced his friend that painting was fun, and he actually got his friend to paint the fence. Okay, so then Tom just kind of watched while his friend painted the fence, and his friend had fun painting it. So that when I read that as a young boy myself, that resonated with me, and I remembered it ever since. And so whenever I see somebody trying to get someone else to do their work, kind of in a fun way, I'll call it, "Oh yeah, you're Tom Sawyering the person." So that's my worldview, right? My for that particular idea. But to someone that's not familiar with the story, or for who may probably read the story in school and didn't really think one thing or another about that scene, it wouldn't necessarily pop into their minds when I say that. Okay, so that's why it's important to understand that when you're asked to reflect, when you're asked to read something and write about it, we're not necessarily asking for you to agree with it, or even to really have a strong opinion about it, because sometimes you just don't. Okay, but there'll be other things that you'll have a strong opinion about. Okay, so that's what reflection's all about. It's your honest opinion about something, even if that opinion is negative or neutral. Um, and so with that, then we've read that little bit there. So we're asked to reflect on that, and that's on page 24 of the unit. And now we talk a little bit about the 60 scoop, and it's actually here in the course text. There's a whole bit about it. As a matter of fact, maybe we just do that instead. Here it is right here. Okay, so the 60 scoop. So this is again not a very good, um, not the best time in Canada's history. Okay, Canada's a great nation. I don't want to sound like I'm really down. And we have the benefit of hindsight. We can look back and say, maybe that wasn't the best thing for us to do. But you know, yeah, it really impacted an awful lot of people. Okay, so here's the thing. So the 60 scoop, it said it says here, and this is on page. I guess I better tell you what page. This is on page 169 of the course text. So it says, while residential schools were still active, there were additional challenges to Aboriginal identities, communities, and nations. The first was the continued impact of the Indian Act, determining who had status as an Indian, and the result that many women lost Indian status, as you read in Chapter 4. In some cases, this meant First Nations women and their children were forced to leave their communities. Now, as a matter of fact, there's something in the news, and I'll let you go on there. Some communities do have a marry out, stay out policy. Okay, so it's funny that the Indian Act was doing that, and that was something imposed by the government. But there are some communities, and one of them was in the news recently about that because they're starting to enforce it more aggressively. And basically, if an Aboriginal person, a band member, marries someone not from the band or not Aboriginal, then they are not allowed to live in the community. Okay? So that has been in the news. You can go and find that. Um, so, but in this case, we're talking about it being imposed by the Indian Act. Okay. So that's a way, in a way, for the government to kind of reduce the number of Aboriginal people, right? Isn't it? I mean, once a woman marries, and she doesn't marry an Aboriginal person, then you basically lose your status, and your children don't have status, and so on and so on. Okay, so that whole generation from there on loses their status. And then a second challenge was a policy that emerged to remove children from First Nation, Métis, and Inuit families and communities at an alarming rate. For the general population in Canada, child welfare services took children away from their homes and placed them in foster and adoption programs, supposedly only as a last resort. However, removing a First Nation, Métis, or Inuk child from home, family, and community became a common practice. Because this practice was first noted in the 1960s, it became known as the 60 scoop, but the practice continues today. Okay, all right. Now, you see, it says this. Now, this textbook was written a couple of years ago. Um, okay, again, we're allowed to challenge stuff. Um, I wonder how, because they're just saying a practice continues today. Certainly it happens. Does it happen more than it does in the general population? Does it happen more in the than it does in the general population of Canada, or is it still at a very high rate? The text isn't really clear on that. Okay, and I don't really know. So maybe maybe in your community you notice a lot of children get put in homes, right? Or maybe a lot of them don't, right? So, and I'm sure we can all find examples of cases where the child was taken away when probably, there wasn't a really good reason, and there are probably lots of cases where the child was left in a home where really they should have been taken out. So there's the issue, isn't it? Right? And then it's sort of complicated by the fact that in some communities and in some families, the child doesn't have to be taken out of the home. The child can be moved to a relative's place, right? An aunt, an uncle, a kookum, whatever. Um, so, is that actually being done, or are kids being scooped up? So let's just continue here. So it says adoptions practiced historically by First Nations and Inuit families kept children within their communities and connected to their roots. Adoptions by non-Aboriginal families often cut the children off from their roots with no opportunity to understand their cultural identity or their traditional roles and responsibilities. Okay. Some children were raised in cities with no connections with their homelands or elders or wisdom keepers. In the scoop, each child would suffer the impact, and communities lost great numbers of each generation. So there's the other thing, right? There are two things kind of that are happening. One is the impact on the child as the child grows up, and basically they're being given a different worldview, they're being given a different identity, and they have no chance to connect with their original identity. None. And they won't be able to speak their language. They maybe their spiritual beliefs will be changed. Everything changes. They're even how they view their own nation may be impacted. Um, but there's another impact. And the other impact is that communities lose their children. I mean, their children are taken away. And so you have a community that's missing some or most of its young children. So, and the way communities work is that the next generation takes over from the last. So what happens? And elders are cared for um, by younger community members, right? That's the way it worked. This idea of putting an elder in a home, I'm pretty sure that's something. I know that's something that's pretty common in the South, right? But a lot of cultures and a lot of nations wouldn't dream of doing that. Okay, but you got to have young people to look after the elders. And now it says here, adoptees were separated from siblings and isolated from their culture, and sometimes subject to substandard care. Okay, substandard care. Artist George Littlechild was a foster child from infancy and lost contact with his four siblings, parents, and nation. Over time, he became an activist. And the concept of, all right, let me try this. Wakoman Kanak. Wakoman Kanak. All right, I tried. Plains Cree for honoring ancestors has inspired his art and life. Okay, now it's a great story, and that kind of gives you a hint now of how some people react to these traumatic events, right? He became an activist. Okay, now the substandard care, there's right there. One of the things about foster children and First Nations children and other foster children, at a time when farms were really big, one of the things that people did was they got foster children for whom they got paid, but the foster children were expected to work on the farm. So basically, the foster parents were doing it not always, and this happens. It's not necessarily all of them, but the foster parents were doing this really as a benefit to themselves, right? They were getting paid for the foster child, plus the foster child was free labor. So the more foster children they had, the better things were for them. Okay. So in some cases that happened, And so then the child grows up not only, losing their contact with their nation and their identity and their language and everything, but also they have a childhood where they just have to work, first thing in the morning, and late at night, and when school isn't in session, they're working all day, just working hard labor on a farm. Okay. So, and that's, that can't necessarily be, it may not be a very loving or supportive environment, even, you know, um, with everything else going on. Okay. So it wasn't always the case with foster parents, but that's one of the abuses that can happen. Okay. So, let's have a look, because I think we're kind of partway through this here, but let's take a look at what Suzanne Fournier and Ernie Cray say in this. I guess it's a book, Stolen from Our Embrace. So it says here, through its delicate assault, sorry, pause ahead, back up here. Um, Through its deliberate assault on the Aboriginal family, the residential school system created the conditions that rendered First Nations vulnerable to the next wave of intervention: child abductions sanctioned by provincial child welfare laws. Residential schools incarcerated children for 10 months of the year, but at least the children stayed in an Aboriginal peer group. They always knew their First Nation origin and who their parents were, and they knew that eventually they would be going home. In the foster and adoptive care system, Aboriginal children typically vanished without a trace. The vast majority of them placed until they were adults in non-Aboriginal homes where their cultural identity, their legal Indian status, their knowledge of their own First Nation, and even their birth names were erased, often forever. Okay, so that is an extreme thing. Okay, and that's why it has its own name, the 60s scoop. Okay, so all right. So just to continue the in the course text here, and this should be at the top of page. Sorry about all this here. Okay. So it's going to be at the top of page 170. Okay, and it says, in addition to the removal of children from families and communities, another issue is the quality of the alternative care that those children received. Okay, so there you go, and that's what I was really getting at. In some cases, the kids being fostered were just used as cheap labor. The funding for child welfare services for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children was and continues to be lower than for non-Aboriginal populations. Lower funding means fewer resources available for the best actions to be taken for the welfare of the child. So isn't that a kind of a paradox where they're taking the child away from the parents supposedly for the welfare of the child, but then they're not adequately funding the care of the child, whether the child's in a foster home or a group home or whatever it is. Now, here's an interesting thing, is remember I was questioning the course text when they said that the scoop continues to this day, and I sort of question that because I somehow find it difficult to imagine that all of the abuses are still going on. Let's see what the course text has to say about it. It says, although called the 60s scoop, the removal of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children continues at high rates with profound impact on individuals, families, communities, and nations. Aboriginal children are disproportionately represented in foster care in Canada. Provincial and territorial ministries of child and family services suggest that 20 to 40% of children and youth placed in care from 2000 to 2002 had Aboriginal ancestry, yet Aboriginal children made up less than 5% of the total child population in Canada. In Manitoba in 2000, Aboriginal children made up nearly 80% of children living in out-of-home care. Wow. Aboriginal children and youth in care are frequently placed in homes apart from their own communities. This experience can contribute to a lack of connection to their heritage and cultural identities, as well as to their ancestral lands and nations, and many feel isolated. Feelings of alienation can lead young people of any background to be drawn towards whatever might give them a sense of belonging, including gangs. Gang activity and exposure to alcohol and drugs have become an increasing concern for Aboriginal youth. A critical concern involving Aboriginal youth, however, is increasing rates of suicide, which you will consider in the next section. Yes, that is something that we're gonna look at some point. Okay. So what they're saying is that the Aboriginal children who are taken out away from their families are disproportionately represented in foster care. So okay, I'll accept that. I would like to think that the placements are a little more considered, and there is more cultural sensitivity, but it's really hard to tell. That's one of the things. I know some people that work in this foster care system, so I should actually ask them about that. All right. So, but it's certainly going to be traumatic, isn't it, for a child to be taken out of their home, okay, for whatever reason. So that would be hopefully be a last resort. Okay, let's take a look then. If we go back to the course material, we're actually ready to look at the key question for this. Let's see if I can. Let's see here. Okay. So, okay, we've already done that. We've done the 60 scoop. So here's a support question, and so this is a support question for bottom of page 24. It says research to learn about programs to help Aboriginal adoptees um, who want to reconnect with their families and communities, or programs to support parenting in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit families. Okay, so there's a couple of things, and you could, if you wanted to do something like this, you could also add your own thing. Maybe you could look at, because it's funny, I was just talking about that, right? Saying, I know some people who work in the foster care system. I could ask them what they do to maintain the cultural identity of their foster children. So, that could be something. If you know someone that works in that system, someone that works at Tiganagan, right, you could actually ask them, or you don't even have to know them. You could just go and ask. Tell them you're a student and you're studying this. Most people are really keen to tell you about their jobs and about what they do. So it is kind of, it can be intimidating to approach someone, but if you ask, most people are very, very, uh, they want to be helpful. Okay. So there you go. You can do one of these two suggested researches, or you could, come up with your own idea, and you could always ask me if you want to do something that's not one of these two things, and you're looking for an idea. Okay. You don't necessarily just have to take one of those. Okay. The idea of learning stuff like this is to find something that interests you, that resonates with you, that's related to the course material. In this case, it's what young children who were taken away and placed in foster care. You know, that's what we're studying. So, you can find some information about that, about foster care in general, about non-Aboriginal adoptions of Aboriginal children. Okay, and for example, what the rules are now, I understand the rules are supposed to be stricter now, that make it very difficult for children to be adopted by Aboriginal children being adopted by non-Aboriginal families. But I don't know, maybe it's more common than I believe. Okay. So, and then here's here's a link, and you may actually, when they give you a website there, that's usually not a good idea. Just do a search on that, or search for James Bartleman. Okay. So there you go. All right, well, let's take a look at the key questions, and these are key question number 9, and this is what you're going to hand in, okay, for question, key question 9. So it says use the textbook and textbook page, and they don't actually tell you what page, and the internet. Okay, so then they're going to, frequently asked questions on residential schools. So if you have trouble finding that, just let me know, and I'll try and point you in the right direction. Sometimes when they use a link in a reference, sometimes a link is not there when you try to find it. So it says complete the following assignment and submit your work to your teacher. Use software of your choice to design a poster. Okay, so you could use Word, right, to make a poster that will illustrate your awareness of the history and impact of the legacy of Native residential schools. Okay. And yeah, Microsoft Publisher, that's available. Um, uh, you could use PowerPoint or Word. Those are two. Okay, all these ones that they're giving you here are pretty old. You can also hand draw a poster and submit it to your teacher. Certainly, I don't mind that. It's in your best interest to work with technology if you can. That's what employers are looking for nowadays. And if you are maybe a little weak on PowerPoint, maybe you haven't used it before, maybe you could try that one, and it would kind of help you learn it at the same time. So it says, yeah, and if I get any posters from people with your permission, I would post them on our on my Facebook page, only with your permission, of course. Okay, I would never post your work without your permission, so don't worry about that. So you're going to make just a poster to illustrate your awareness of history. Now, the way this works, the way something like this is marked is with a rubric. This is called a rubric, and you see the different levels here. Okay, so your goal, I mean, really your goal is a level 3, but really you want to aim for this, right? Because if you aim for level 4 and you fall just a little short, you're still going to land on level 3. Okay, so if you're aiming for level 1 and you fall a little short, well then you land, well, have you ever been bowling? That would be that's when you don't actually get it right down the lane and it falls into the alley. So you don't want it to go there, okay? You don't want to, you don't want that. Okay, so this is the way a rubric works. Now, this rubric has level 4, the highest level. On the right, do be aware that some rubrics actually put level 4 on the left. Okay, when I make them, that's the way I do it. So this one's a little bit, it really depends. So if you're looking at a rubric, just look at the level numbers and then try and figure out if it goes from low to high or high to low. Okay, so here's what we're trying to do. In this category, it says knowledge and understanding, use of knowledge and content. So what is a level 4 excellent? A level 4 excellent, and this is a description of how your poster would be. Excellent knowledge of issues concerning Native residential school. Okay, excellent. Okay, now on level 3 says good knowledge of issues concerning Native residential school. Okay, so what's the difference between excellent and good? All right, well, let's say that you put on Native residential school on your poster something that represents loss of identity, something that represents disconnection from culture, something that represents assimilation, right? Something that represents abuse, right? Something that represents um, isolation, alienation, loneliness, right? So all of those things, right? That would be under excellent, right? So pretty much everything we discussed, everything in the text, what happens to a young person when they go to residential school. Okay. Good would just be something where you did some of them, but there were a lot of ones that you left off of there. Okay, so remember, we're not asking you to list all those, we're just asking you to represent all of those things, right? So some sort of poster, a diagram. You could use words if you want, that would represent them, right? But it it would be, maybe see if you can come up with a graphical way of representing. Okay. Okay, so that's a level 4. So you try to get a level 4. And then here, thinking. Okay, use of critical creative thinking to create awareness of native residential schools. So how do you get a level 4 here? Well, excellent use of critical thinking to create awareness of native residential schools. Okay, and then a good is a good use. Okay, so what's the difference there? Okay, so critical thinking, in your poster, you're going to have maybe a strong image or a strong words, right, to create that awareness, right? So some sort of graphic that really shows some aspect of the issues in residential schools, right? Maybe you could show, for example, and I'll give you an example right from the text. Okay, the picture where they showed a young man. Oh boy, let me try and find this because this is really good. On page. Oh, okay. I'm trying to turn the pages of the book here, and it's gotten really humid. Get the window open. Okay, so it's on page 165 of your book. Okay, the photo on the bottom of page 165, where it shows a young Thomas More. Okay, in his regalia, in his uh, traditional costume. I think they show him holding a pistol, which is probably not very realistic because he looks to be about um, 8 or 9. But anyway, and then they show him dressed as a proper English gentleman, and so to speak, in the other picture. So that is a very powerful image, and that's the sort of thing that we're looking for in the excellent, right? So really contrasting, maybe a picture of what the child would be doing before they go to residential school. It may be out hunting or out doing something traditional, practicing their culture, right? Drumming, dancing, whatever, and then a picture of them sitting in rows of desks, or reading from a blackboard, or uh, you know uh, reciting the Lord's Prayer or something like that, right? So that's what we're looking for, right? To sort of show somebody who's looking at your poster what they had and what they were given or put into. Okay, that's the critical thinking. Okay. Um, and then the next one here is communication. So that's your expression and organization of ideas. And so basically, what I would be looking for there, well, complete sentences, if you use sentences, but mostly well organized, grammatically correct and free of spelling errors, provides illustrations that well convey key ideas. Okay, so now this is assuming you put some writing there. But when we say communication, communication is not necessarily by writing. Communication can be by your visuals. So basically, your visuals tell a story. They're clear. They're understandable. They're well laid out. They're all crowded together. So that's communication. I think we better wrap this up really quick here. Just one more thing: your application and knowledge of skills. And so in this case, it would just be the pulling the whole project together and making a cohesive whole, right? So that when we look at your poster, it's really clear what it's about. It really powerfully conveys the message that you're trying to, right? We don't have to think about it too hard. Okay, so, and it's just a nice creative poster. That's what we're looking for. All right. Now, don't get too wound up about this. A nice poster will get you a good mark on this. So, and if you're not real sure, you can always send me a picture of it beforehand, before you glue everything down, or just sketch me your idea or something like that, and I'll let you know how it'll be. Okay. All right. Well, we'll wrap that up for tonight then, and so tomorrow will be the last class of the week, And that'll be lesson 10, and so we'll wrap up Unit 2 halfway through the course. Thanks for joining us tonight. Bye now.